active transport. Define active transport. Describe the factors needed for active transport to take place. So, this is part of the 3.2 AQA topic cells, and it's 3.2.3 transport across cell membranes. So active transport is the movement of molecules or ions against a concentration gradient from low to high using energy and carrier proteins. And it differs from passive transport because it requires energy or ATP. It moves against its concentration gradient. It uses carrier proteins or pumps, and it is a selective or specific process. And active transport uses ATP either by using ATP directly to move molecules or using a concentration gradient already been set up by direct active transport in a process called co-transport. So the process involved in simple active transport is that you have these carrier proteins which span the membrane, and they will accept molecules on one side. Then the molecule will bind to the receptors on the carrier protein, and on the inside of the cell, ATP binds to proteins and is hydrolyzed to form ADP and PI, and the energy release is used to change the protein's shape in order to open at the other side and release the molecule or ion on the other side. And phosphate is released and recombines to form ATP, and when that happens, the protein reverts back to its original shape. But as I said before, you can also get a process called co-transport, and that is where more than one molecule is moved at the same time. And either they can be moved in the same direction, as in uptake of glucose, the co-transport of glucose in the epithelial cells of the ileum, or they can move in the opposite direction, like the sodium-potassium pump. So sometimes more than one molecule move in the same direction at the same time, like co-transport of glucose, or occasionally the molecules can be moved, one molecule is moved in one direction and the other in the other. So the sodium-potassium pump, 3 sodium move out at the same time, 2 potassium move in. And that's involved in nerve impulses, which you'll learn about in upper sixth. So now looking at co-transport in the lumen of the ileum, the first thing that happens is sodium ions are actively transported out of the epithelial cells into the blood. And as that happens, it's going from a low to high concentration. It means there's now a really low concentration of sodium left in the epithelial cell. It's lower than the lumen, the amount of sodium, the concentration of sodium in the lumen. So there's a high concentration of sodium here and a low concentration in the epithelial cell. Therefore, sodium moves down its diffusion gradient from the lumen into the epithelial cell using a co-transport protein, but at the same time it pulls glucose molecules with it against their concentration gradient. So this is known as co-transport because as sodium moves down its concentration gradient with the co-transport protein, glucose is moved against its concentration gradient into the epithelial cell. And now, because you've moved glucose from the lumen into the epithelial cell, you've now got a high concentration of glucose here in comparison to the blood. So then glucose is facilitatedly diffused from the epithelial cell into the blood. Now it's important to bear in mind that active transport of glucose only happens once the concentration of glucose is lower in lumen of the ileum than the epithelial cell. Initially, the glucose will be taken into the blood by facilitated diffusion. It's only when the concentration gradient becomes where it has to go against its concentration gradient that starts to happen. So, factors affecting the rate of active transport. So, when active transport moves molecules and ions against their concentration gradient, a decrease in concentration gradient doesn't affect the rate of active transport. The rate of active transport is, however, affected by the speed of the individual carrier proteins. So, obviously, the faster they work, the faster the rate of active transport. The number of carrier proteins present, so the more proteins there are, the faster the rate of active transport. The rate of respiration in the cell, the availability of the cell of ATP, and obviously if respiration is inhibited, active transport can't take place because there's no ATP. So here's just a look at the summary of the different processes in which you can transport molecules or ions across cell membranes. So you've got diffusion, which is the net movement of particles from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, and it's passive, so it doesn't require energy. Facilitated diffusion is the net movement of particles from an area of high to an area of low concentration, and it uses carrier proteins and channel proteins to aid the diffusion of large molecules and charged particles through the membrane, and again, it's a passive process. Osmosis is the movement of water molecules across a partially permeable membrane from an area of high water potential to an area of low water potential. And again, it's passive. And then active transport is the movement of molecules from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. It uses carrier proteins and co-transporters to transport molecules, and it is an active process, so it requires energy. So in summary, active transport, you need to know about active transport involving the role of carrier proteins and the importance of hydrolysis of ATP. Co-transport, as illustrated by the absorption of sodium ions and glucose by cells lining the mammalian ileum.